like we're live, right? Welcome everybody. Welcome to our regular Thursday night Big Book study meeting. We're doing something a little different the last couple of weeks. Last week and this week we've looked at some stuff that's outside of the realm of the Big Book a little bit, relative to Ebby Thatcher and his influence on Bill and his meeting with Bill, carrying the message to Bill, and we talked about Bill's spiritual experience and that stuff last week. So this week we're going to look at Bill Wilson's trip to Akron, Ohio, and what happened there, and his eventual meeting with Dr. Bob, and kind of the miracles that took place there. I'm going to start with some readings out of Bob S.'s pre-AA history book here, and I'm going to read a little bit from his writings about the Akron business trip and Bill meeting with Henrietta and Bill meeting with Bob. But first, I've put together a little bit of a timeline to help you kind of see the order of how things occurred. So in late August, early September 1934, Ebby Thatcher, Edwin Throckmorton Thatcher, who he was born in 1896, he died in 66. I think he was 37 or 38 when he got sober. So gives you a little reference there. He appeared before Judge Collins G. And remember the Oxford group, men, Shep C., Sebra, and Roland, all kind of stood before the judge and said, "Judge, let us have him. We'll be responsible for him." And they saved him from commitment, right? So that was basically when he got sober. And so just with 2 months of sobriety, Ebby visits Bill Wilson, and you read in the Big Book Bill's account of Ebby coming to visit with him and tell him, he says, "Bill, I've got religion," okay, and that's the story in the Big Book. So around mid-November, Bill journeys back to Calvary Mission. Remember we talked about that, how he meets up with that Nordsman, was it? I forget the guy's name. The Finnish guy, I think it was, and he gets drunk on the way to the mission, and he gets to the mission, and he just about gets kicked out, and Ebby finally locates Ebby, and Ebby brings him in, and he answers an altar call, and he ends up at the front of the altar telling everybody how it is, and he was drunk, but he had a real profound experience. He accepted Christ into his life, or Jesus into his life at that time. So it was significant for him, but when he went home, he tapered back on instead of tapering off when he woke up the next morning. But on December 11th, 1934, Bill's last drink, he entered Towns Hospital, and that was his last drink. So from December till May of 1935, Bill worked with apparently hundreds of alcoholics at the mission, bars, on the streets of New York, without even one single success. And he was very dismayed by this. And in 1935, in the spring of 1935, he journeyed to Akron, Ohio on a business venture. There was a proxy fight in a company, and that was just two elements of a company fighting for control of the company, and they lost their bidding. So I'm going to read from Bob's book here. So, two important lessons. He said, in the spring of 1935, Bill divulged to Lois that perhaps he had been a flop in fixing drunks, to which she replied, "But Bill, don't you see you're sober?" Dr. Silkworth also had this to say on the situation. He told Bill to stop preaching and start discussing his allergy to alcohol and his seeming inability to stop starting. and that he was hopeless, not only after the first drink, but also before the first drink. Isn't that interesting? Interesting thought, that he was hopeless. Not only after taking a drink was he hopeless, but he was hopeless even before the first drink. And that's what the book says in the beginning, doesn't it? It suffers from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. So he says it was probable that most of Bill's clients had had their fill of sermons at the Calvary Mission. I would say so. They've probably been preached at a lot. These two lessons were to save Bill's sobriety in the following month of May. Businessman Howard Tompkins of New York's Beer and Company, believe that or not, was impressed with Bill's recovery, which led to a job offer in relation to a proxy fight involving the Akron company, the National Rubber Machine Company. If Bill could have pulled this off, he might have been president and be back in the chips once again. Things were looking good, but after a brief return trip from New York, the tide had changed and the opponents seemed to have won. Yet there was hope in legal matters, and Bill was left in Akron with the promise that Beer and Company would financially support his efforts. The others returned to New York on Friday, May 10th, 1935, leaving Bill alone in a strange city. The next day, a Saturday afternoon, Bill's apprehension grew as he paced the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel, wondering what was next. He was down to $10 and board. The cheerful chatter from the hotel bar certainly seemed inviting. How about enjoying a ginger ale and sitting up and striking up a conversation? No harm in that, right? Sounds harmless, right? Sounds like something I'd do. After all, had he not been dry for almost 5 months? Why, even just a few drinks might be all right. Now remember, up to this point in time, he'd been trying to sober up other drunks in New York, but his only real means of support were Oxford group meetings. There was no Alcoholics Anonymous at this time. So the only support that he had was that with Shep C. and Roland and Ebby and so forth. And so there wasn't this organized program of recovery or the things that we always enjoy today. But Bill immediately felt the grip of terror of that first drink. He remembered what Lois had told him and realized that he needed to talk with another alcoholic, or it was curtains. He espoused a directory of local ministers and for no conscious reason phoned a certain Reverend Tunks, who turned out to be the strongest Oxford grouper of all the ministers in Akron. Was this yet another coincidence? So, think about it. He's in the Mayflower Hotel in Akron, Ohio. His business has failed. He's ready to drink. He's desperate. He sees this directory on the wall of church pastors, local churches in Akron, and he goes down through this list. Now, I'll read in Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers in a minute, and it says that he phoned, I don't know how many it says that he phoned, but it says that when he got a hold of Reverend Tunks, that he was provided 10 phone numbers of Oxford group members. And Reverend Tunks was the one that he was able to actually get a hold of that provided him the 10 numbers, and Henrietta Seiberling was the Oxford group member that he was actually able to reach. It says, was this yet another occurrence of Carl Jung's synchronicity, or dare say that of a more providential nature? So Bill meets Henrietta. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to go to Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, and I'm going to start reading from the chapter, which is chapter 6, and it's entitled Two Alcoholics Meet. It's page 63 if you have this book, Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. So Bill called Henrietta out of his own desperation when, after pacing up and down the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel on South Main Street in downtown Akron, he suddenly realized that he needed to talk to another drunk in order to keep from drinking himself. The Mayflower, with its sleek Art Deco facade, was practically new, the best, most modern hotel in Akron. On Saturday night, people came from downtown to shop, maybe eat at a restaurant and go to a movie. Ginger Rogers, Fred Astaire were starring in Roberta at the Rialto, and James Cagney was featured in G-Men in another theater. There was a festive air in the Mayflower lobby that night with the warm, tempting laughter Bill remembered coming from the bar. Probably the bar was unusually crowded, and many private parties were being held in the hotel suites because guests were gathering for the small annual May ball given by the St. Thomas Hospital Guild. Sister Ignatia would have been there, along with the young doctor Tom Scuddery. As a member of the courtesy staff, Dr. Bob, too, might well have put in an appearance had he been sober. Instead of joining the merrymakers at the bar, Bill got the guidance to look at the minister's directory in the lobby. Henrietta said, quote, "And a strange thing happened. He just looked there, and he put his finger on one name, Dr. Walter Tunks." That's how this book recounts it. So Bill called Dr. Tunks, and Dr. Tunks gave him a list of names. One of them was Norman Shepard, who was a close friend of mine and knew I was trying to do what I was trying to do for Bob. Norman said to Bill, "I have to go to New York tonight, but you call Henrietta Seiberling. She will see you." As Bill described it, he had already called 9 names on the list of 10, and Henrietta's was the last. But Bill remembered having once met a Mr. Seiberling, former president of the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, assumed that this was his wife and couldn't imagine calling her with such a plea. He's calling us, "Hey, do you got a drunk I can talk to?" Can you imagine? But Bill recalled something kept saying to me, "You'd better call her." Because she had been enabled to face and transcend other calamities, she certainly did understand mine, Bill said. Quote, she was to become a vital link to those fantastic events which were presently to gather around the birth and development of our AA society, unquote. Of all the names the obliging rector had given me, she was the only one who cared enough. I would like here to record our timeless gratitude, Bill concluded. Henrietta, of course, was not the wife of the rubber company president, but his daughter-in-law. She lived in the gatehouse lodge of the Seiberling estate on Portage Path, a short distance from the Smiths' home. Henrietta tried to get Bob and Ann over to her house that Saturday. Could they come over to meet a friend of hers, a sober alcoholic, who might help Bob with his drinking problem? At the moment, Bob was upstairs in a stupor. This was Mother's Day, okay? Was upstairs in a stupor, having brought home a large Mother's Day plant, putting it on the kitchen table and collapsing on the floor. It had been all Ann and the children could do to get him upstairs. Annie merely said at first that she didn't think it would be possible for them to make it there that day. But Dr. Bob recalled, "Henry is very persistent and a very determined individual." She said, "Oh, yes, come over. I know he'll be helpful to Bob." Annie still didn't think it very wise to go over that day, Dr. Bob continued. Finally, Henry bore in to such an extent that Annie had to tell her I was very bagged and had passed all capability of listening to any conversation, and the visit would just have to be postponed. Henrietta called the Smiths again on Sunday. "Will Bob be able to make it today?" I don't remember ever feeling much worse, but I was very fond of Henry, and Annie had said we would go over. Bob went on. So we started over. On the way, I extracted a solemn promise from Annie that 15 minutes of this stuff would be tops. I didn't want to talk to this mug or anybody else, and we'd really made it snappy. I said, "Now these are the actual facts. We got there at 5 o'clock, and it was 11:15 when we left." So how long is that? Six hours and 15 minutes. He said, I'll give him 15 minutes, is what he said initially. So 6 hours and 15 minutes later, it's said that they stepped into this little room, and if you ever visit the Gatehouse Lodge in Akron, you can step into the room and see the room where these two men sat and talked. Smitty recalled that although his father was pretty nervous, he was sober when they drove over to Henrietta's to meet this fellow who might help him. I did not sit in on that meeting, of course, being a kid at the time, and Mother wanted Dad to open up in front of Bill. So I have no knowledge of what transpired there. However, I remember Bill came to stay at our home shortly afterward. Describing his meeting with the man who was to be my partner, the wonderful friend with whom I was never to have a hard word, Bill said, Bob did not look much like a founder. He was shaking badly, uneasily. He told us that he could stay only about 15 minutes. Though embarrassed, he brightened a little when I said I thought he needed a drink. After dinner, which he did not eat, Henrietta discreetly put us off in her little library. There, Bob and I talked until 11 o'clock. What actually happened between the two men, one of the shortest and most appealing versions, came from Dr. Bob's old schoolmate, Arba J. Irvin, who at least gave proper recognition to what was to become AA's unofficial beverage, coffee, and then selling it 15 cents a pound. And so they got together and started talking about helping each other and helping the men with similar difficulties. They went out into the city's lower edges, the city of Akron, and gathered together a group of drunks, and they started talking and drinking coffee. Bob's wife told me she had never made as much coffee as she did in the next 2 weeks. And they stayed there drinking coffee and starting this group of one helping the other, and that was the way AA developed. This is true, but as we know, there was more to it than that. There is such a thing as keeping it too simple. A number of people had been chipping away at Bob for years. The Oxford group had a program. Henrietta had told him, you must not touch 1 drop of alcohol. Obviously, Bill brought something new himself. What did he say to Dr. Bob that hadn't already been said? How important were the words? How important compared to the fact that it was one alcoholic talking to another alcoholic? No one can say precisely. Indeed, Dr. Bob and Bill themselves placed slightly different emphasis on the factors involved. In AA Comes of Age, written about 20 years later, after Bill had analyzed the event in the light of subsequent experience, he said that he went very slowly on the fireworks of religious experience. First, he talked about his own case until Bob got a good identification with me. Then, as Dr. William D. Silkworth had urged, Bill hammered home the physical aspects of the disease, the verdict of the inevitable annihilation. This, Bill felt, brought about in Dr. Bob an ego deflation that triggered him into a new life. Describing their talk as a completely mutual thing, Bill said, I had quit preaching. I knew that I needed this alcoholic as much as he needed me. This was it. And this mutual give and take at the very heart of all of AA's 12th step work today, is at the very heart of all of AA's 12th step work today. In Alcoholics Anonymous, the volume, published almost exactly 4 years after their first meeting, Dr. Bob noted that Bill was a man who had been cured by the very means I had been trying to employ, that is to say, the spiritual approach. He gave me information about the subject of alcoholism, which was undoubtedly helpful. This is a quote. Of far more importance, he continued, was the fact that he was the first living human with whom I had ever talked who knew what he was talking about in regard to alcoholism from actual experience. In other words, he talked my language. He knew all the answers, and certainly not because he had picked them up in his reading. Whatever Bill said, and in the course of some 5 hours of conversation, he must have thrown in everything he ever knew or thought or guessed about alcoholism, and told the long version of his story to boot. Bob stopped drinking immediately. Bill seemed to place more emphasis on what he was saying than on the fact that he himself was saying it, while Bob indicated that, though it was helpful, he had heard most of it before. Important to him was the fact that another alcoholic was telling him. If William James, Carl Young, and Dr. Silkworth, along with Frank Buchanan and all the members of the Oxford group, had been doing the talking, it would have just been another lecture. Sue remembered, that's Dr. Bob's daughter, Sue remembered that she kept expecting her parents home almost any minute that Sunday evening, but they didn't come until almost midnight. When they did return, her father seemed more at ease than he had been. Although he still wasn't in good shape, he apparently looked better all around. He was quite enthused about his talk with you, she told Bill. I can remember that. He didn't go into the whole lot, but I do remember Dad saying that you seemed to hit it off with him more because you both had the same thing. He realized that it wasn't just him. He told me that members of the Oxford group just didn't have the same type of problems. So this was true. There, even Shep C. and Roland and Sebra were not necessarily alcoholic. They were problem drinkers. They were periodics. They had problems with alcohol from time to time, but they didn't identify themselves as alcoholic. So, as Bill put it, the spark was struck. Then Bill recalled in a conversation with T. Henry Williams, the group was formed here in the middle of your group. And it grew fast because you folks worked harder, I guess, T. Henry said. We had to, Bill said. We were under awful compulsion, and we found that we had to do something for somebody or actually perish ourselves. Bill stayed in Akron, Henrietta said. There was a neighbor of mine who had seen the change in my life brought about by the Oxford group, and I called him and asked him to put Bill up at the country club for 2 weeks or so, just to keep him in town, because I knew Bill had no money left. It was late May, and while Bill and Dr. Bob may have realized that something very special had happened between them, there was evidence that they had that they had no idea of this significance. That is, neither of them said anything to this effect. Well, we're co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, and we better get started writing the 12 steps. Dr. Bob cited another point of identification, the association of both with the Oxford group. Bill in New York for 5 months, and I in Akron for 2.5 years. Do you understand how the Oxford group had influence in both of their lives in different places? I mean, how significant that is. I just think that that's amazing.
So, Wes, I got a question.
Go ahead.
So, the Oxford group, they weren't Alcoholics Anonymous. Most of them had problems with alcohol, but, like, what was it? Everybody, you said that some of them did.
Some of them did, yeah. They were, my understanding is that they believed in what is considered first century Christian practices and beliefs. Okay, so my understanding of first century Christian practices would be, I should probably get better information. But they believed in the 4 absolutes, okay? Absolute love, purity. I'm not a historian, I'm sorry.
I wasn't sure about, like, what the Oxford group actually was.
It was a very Christian organization, but it wasn't, they weren't involved in the religious aspect of Christianity as they were involved in the spiritual aspect of Christianity, which would be the relationship of themselves to God, okay, or Christ, as they were Christians. So, is that helpful? honesty,
unselfishness,
unselfishness,
purity, and love.
purity, and love. Okay, were the four absolutes. And so
There's actually a pamphlet on it.
there are
Alcoholics
the,
Anonymous.
there's a lot of information about the Oxford group, and what the early members of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill, Bob, and others discovered was that the drunkie couldn't accept these tenets across the board. That in the Oxford group, you came into the group, you had to confess your belief in that Jesus is the Son of God and accept Christ as your Savior. And a lot of the drunks couldn't do that. They couldn't accept those type of regiments, okay? And so that's how they started to break away from the strictness of the Oxford group, and that it wasn't just for alcoholics, that it was for anyone, you know. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Okay. I've lost my spot here. Okay, here it is. So, Bill in New York for 5 months and I in Akron for 2.5 years. But there was a significant difference. Bill had acquired their ideas of service. I had not. That was the difference. This idea, which Bill brought and Dr. Bob never forgot, was put into action immediately. They started trying to help yet another drunk. In a letter to Lois, Bill noted that he was writing from the office of one of my new friends, Dr. Smith, who had my trouble. He said together they were working to change a once prominent surgeon who had developed into a terrific rake and drunk. Conceivably, this could have been the fellow Betty B. remembered, the doctor who wheeled patients into the operating room in the dead of night. Bill's letter was dated May of 1935, and thus showed they had started carrying the message together at least within 2 weeks or so of their first meeting. So let me show you the next piece on this timeline. So the first week of May in 1935, Bill traveled to Akron, somewhere around the first week of May. On May 10th, his business deal falls through, and on May 11th, fearing for his sobriety, Bill begins making calls from the church directory. He reaches Reverend Tunks, he receives 10 phone numbers, and he places 9 calls, and on the 10th, he reaches Henrietta Cyberlane. And the next day, because Henrietta wanted to meet on the 11th when he called, and Dr. Bob was too drunk, couldn't do it. So on the next morning, they drove over to Henrietta's, and Dr. Bob and Bill meet, and so Bill decides to stay on in Akron after that meeting. Okay.
So they didn't meet the same day he called him?
No.
So this dude just white knuckled it for a day or two?
Well, see, they called him on the 11th. The phone call was made on the 11th. I think that was a Saturday, if I'm not mistaken. Sunday, that was a Sunday because it was Mother's Day. So on Sunday, the phone call was made. Dr. Bob was too drunk to do it. So the next morning, Annie got him to agree to go the next day, and they met at, what time did they say? They met at 5 p.m. to 11:15 or something like that.
Right.
And
he was going down this list of phone numbers because he was like, I want to drink
oh yeah,
now.
oh yeah, he was.
So like he made it from that phone call to the next day. Like,
It gave him hope, something to look forward to.
that's, yeah, I guess.
Well,
It's
and
just-
think about it. I mean, he made a lot of phone calls.
Right.
You know, think about sitting at a payphone, dropping a nickel in each time. You know, you know, and going down this telephone list. You know, it's said that he pointed to Reverend Tunk's name and called that number, but I think he probably made a lot of phone calls. I don't have the history of that exactly. There are probably those that do. So So that was May 12th was the day that they met, okay? May 12th, 1935. And so they met. Bill stays on. He stays at this friend's estate, okay, for a couple of weeks. And on June 2nd, Dr. Bob departs for the AMA convention, and he starts drinking on the train. So, okay, so just because they met and he accepted Bill's offer and ideas, it didn't mean that was the end of his drinking. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, he relapsed on the train, and he spent a week gone. Okay, so on June 4th, he returns from the convention, and he lands back in Akron, and he goes to his nurse's house because he was a doctor, and his nurse and her husband kind of nursed him back into health up until June 10th of 1935, which was a Monday morning. He had a surgery scheduled, and they'll talk more about this probably as we read on. He had a surgery scheduled, and you know what kind of doctor Dr. Bob was, right? He was a proctologist, right? So you know what part of the body he worked on, right? Okay, so yes, right. So he had a surgery scheduled for Monday, June 10th, and he woke up and he was still shaking. And on his way to do the surgery, Bill Wilson gave him a bottle of beer so he could quiet his nerves. That was his last drink on June 10th, 1935. Interesting, huh? All right, well, let's go on.
That sucks. Could you imagine your doctor being...
Okay. So, one letter with a June date. Bill describes Bob and Annie as people 10 or 12 years older than ourselves. Bill was 39, while Bob was 55. Okay, quite a bit. That's a big difference, isn't it? He was in danger of losing his practice, Bill said, though he is apparently a very competent and mighty popular fellow. You will like them immediately. In another letter, Bill mentioned that he was going to move into the Smiths' house. Annie, too, wrote to Lois, who reported this kindness to Bill in her next letter. Bill didn't save the letters then. Lois did. Mrs. Smith is quite flattering, he responded. You see, Bob had been in the Oxford group, and that sort of backslid. They didn't have anyone who really understood alcoholics, and I was used to help him a lot, I think. According to Bill, Annie Smith had decided that practical steps needed to be taken to protect her husband's newfound sobriety. She invited Bill to come live with them. She probably wanted to babysit, right? Says, keep this guy sober, will you? Says, there, I might keep an eye on Dr. Bob and he on me, Bill said. Says, the invitation came at an opportune time. Bill was about broke, even though he had received some money from his partners in New York and was again hoping to come out ahead in the proxy fight that had first brought him to Akron. For the next 3 months, I lived with these two wonderful people, Bill said. So imagine that. So Bill comes to Akron. He meets Dr. Bob after things broke down, and with his business venture. And so after they hook up, he stays with someone on the, I can't remember the word that it used, on the estate. He stayed there for a couple of weeks, and then Annie and Dr. Bob invite him to come stay with them, so he stays on with them for like 3 months. I mean, isn't that kind of amazing? I think it is.
Did Lois go there with him?
No, Lois was back in New York.
I knew he was writing, but
Yeah, he was.
not eventually moved there.
No, he stayed 3 months and then he went back to New York. So for the next 3 months, I lived with these two. Each morning there was a devotion, he recalled. After a long silence in which they awaited inspiration and guidance, Annie would read from the Bible. James was our favorite, he said. Reading from her chair in the corner, she would softly conclude, "Faith without works is dead."
That's where that came from.
Yeah. This is a favorite quotation of Annie's, much as the book of James was a favorite of the early AAs. So much so that the James Club, quote unquote, was favored by some as a name for the fellowship. Isn't that interesting?
That's very interesting.
Good thing it ain't that now.
It calls the James Club, right? She also remembered the quiet time in the mornings, how they sat around reading from the Bible. Later, they also used the upper room, a Methodist publication that provided a daily inspirational message, interdenominational in its approach.
Isn't John Theobald always talking about that?
JT?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
So it was around back then too.
Yeah. Then somebody said a prayer, she recalled. After that, we were supposed to say one ourselves. Then we'd be quiet. Finally, everybody would share what they got or didn't get. That lasted for at least an hour, and sometimes went as long. It lasted a half hour, and sometimes went as long as an hour. So the substance of a morning program was from the very beginning of this thing. So I think that lends such credence to how important that is in our lives today.
Let's say they were doing like a half hour, an hour though.
Half hour to an hour a morning. Okay? That's how they started their day. It says young Smitty was aware of the early morning prayers and quiet time, but he didn't attend. I was too busy siphoning out gas in Dad's car so I could get to high school, he recalled. It says, all of this would take place after breakfast, which with you around, all of this would take place after breakfast, which with you around took place as early as 6 in the morning, Sue said in her talk with Bill. You'd get down there in your bathrobe and scare the daylights out of all of us. You'd sit there draped around this drip coffee pot, then pour it around for everybody. I was more jittery then, Bill said, jittery as hell. I also remember the bottle on the kitchen shelf, Sue said, to prove temptation wasn't there. Oh yes, I forgot about that, said Bill. I was adamant on having liquor. I said we had to prove that you could live in the presence of liquor. So I got 2 big bottles and put them right on the sideboard. And that drove Annie about wild for a while. But I don't really remember you coming to the house until Dad went on the medical convention, Sue said. Bill replied, I had already started to live there, and he said one day, well, what about my going down to the Atlantic City for this convention? This would have been the last day in May, when Dr. Bob had been sober about 2 weeks. The American Medical Association convention began the first week of June. He hadn't missed it in 20 years. Oh no, said Annie, when Dr. Bob brought up the idea. For all her faith, she evidently had a practical side and some instinctive knowledge about alcoholic thinking. Bill, however, was more agreeable to the idea. To him, attending a convention was evidently like keeping liquor on the sideboard. He felt alcoholics had to live in the real world with all its temptations and pitfalls. Annie didn't want to go along with it, but she finally gave in. Dr. Bob, who later recalled he had developed a thirst for scotch as well as for knowledge, began drinking everything he could get as soon as he boarded the train to Atlantic City. On his arrival, he bought several quarts on his way to the hotel. That was Sunday night. He stayed sober on Monday until after dinner, when he drank all I dared in the bar, he said, and then went to my room to finish the job. On Tuesday, Bob started drinking in the morning and was well on his way by noon. I didn't want to disgrace myself, he said, so then I checked out. I headed for the train depot, buying more liquor en route. He remembered only that he had to wait a long time for a train. The next thing he knew, he was coming out of it in the Cuyahoga Falls home of his office nurse and her husband. The blackout was certainly more than 24 hours long because Bill and Annie had waited for 5 days from the time Bob left before they heard from the nurse. She, in response to Bob's call, had picked him up that morning in the Akron Railroad Station in what was described as some state of confusion and disarray. Bob was not fully aware of what was happening. Bill came over and got me home and gave me a hooker. Now, that wasn't that kind of hooker you're thinking of. A hooker or two of scotch that night and a bottle of beer the next morning, he recalled. As Bill and Sue remembered, however, there was a 3-day sobering up period after what was incidentally Dr. Bob's last AMA convention. Do you remember your mother and me going over to the home of his office nurse early in the morning to pick him up? Bill asked Sue. We brought him home and he went to bed. I stayed with him up in that corner room where there were 2 beds. I know he wasn't in too good shape, Sue said. Then the dishes of tomatoes and Cairo syrup came out. That was for the operation, Bill explained. Upon Dr. Bob's return, they had discovered that he was due to perform surgery 3 days later. It was a worrisome thing because if he was too drunk, he couldn't do it. And if he was too sober, he would be too jittery. So we had to load him up with this combination of tomato juice, sauerkraut, and Cairo corn syrup. The idea was to supply him with vitamins from the tomatoes and sauerkraut and energy from the corn syrup. That was a theory we had. We also gave him some beer to steady his nerves. As Bill described it on another occasion, this typical tapering off process took 3 days. There wasn't much sleep for anybody, but Bob cooperated. At 4 o'clock in the morning of the operation, he turned, looked at me, and said, I am going through with this, Bill recalled. You mean you're going through with the operation? I have placed both operation and myself in God's hands. I'm going to do what it takes to get sober and stay that way. At 9 o'clock, he shook miserably as we helped him into his clothes, Bill said. We were panic-stricken. Could he ever do it? Were he too tight or too shaky, it would make little difference. His misguided scalpel might take the life of his patient. It says, on the way to City Hospital on the east side of town, Dr. Bob held out his hand from time to time to see whether the shakes had subsided. Just before they stopped, Bill, who also had his practical side, gave him a bottle of beer. Bill and Annie went back to the house to wait. After many hours, Bob phoned to tell them that the operation had been successful. Still, he hadn't returned right after the call. Had he gone out to celebrate? Annie and Bill had no idea. They could only wait. Finally, Dr. Bob came home. He had spent the hours after the operation making restitution to friends and acquaintances in Akron. The bottle of beer Bill gave him that morning was the last drink he ever had. Although arguments have been and will be made for other significant occasions in AA history, it is generally agreed that Alcoholics Anonymous began there in Akron that day, June 10th, 1935. Cool, huh? Questions? What time we got? 42. All right. So every year there's a celebration called Founders Day weekend up in Akron, and on that weekend some of you have been, I know some of you guys have been, you can go visit these spots. Dr. Bob's house is owned and preserved by a foundation, and they actually bought the house next door to it as well, and there are archives there. You can walk in and see the bookcases with the Sermon on the Mount and the Bible and different books that they read out of and studied out of, and all kinds of archives are available at the AA Central Intergroup office in Akron. You can visit the hospital where Sister Ignatius and Dr. Bob treated alcoholics and sobered men and women up. The celebration takes course at Akron University, and there are meetings, and there's a dance on Saturday night, and you can also visit the Gatehouse Lodge where Bill and Bob met. And let's see, what else can you do while you're there? I think Dr. Bob and Annie's grave. There's a graveside service on Sunday morning. They have a motorcycle procession that leaves the university. It's at like 7 a.m. and we ride out to Dr. Bob and Annie Smith's graveside, and they have a kind of a sunrise graveside service at 7:30 in the morning, and it's an amazing tribute. If you ever get the chance, you want to go to spend the weekend for a Founders Day weekend. So I hope that gives you an understanding of from Ebby Thatcher and how the message was taken to him and how he carried it to Bill, and Bill's carried it to Dr. Bob and the beginnings of Alcoholics Anonymous, and just how significant that was. What we'll do next week is we'll start back up in the Big Book in the first chapter, or I call it the first promise in the Big Book, which is called There Is a Solution. That's the second chapter. And the chapter of There Is a Solution and more about alcoholism are really an understanding of what alcoholism is, a deeper understanding of the insanity of the disease, and the difference between the alcoholic and the problem drinker. And so you'll join us next week, and we'll move forward in the big book. Thank you all for being a part. Okay? We'll call it a night. Thanks.
Thanks, Wes.
Thank you.